In the early hours of January 13, 1972, the people of Ghana awoke to an unexpected radio broadcast. A firm voice came on air and announced the sudden overthrow of the civilian government. The voice was that of Colonel Ignatius Kutu Acheampong, commander of the 1st Infantry Brigade of the Ghanaian Army. In a tone both resolute and charged with drama, Acheampong declared,
"I would like to emphasize immediately that this coup was not initiated by the armed forces merely to satisfy our selfish ends. As I said in my earlier broadcasts, the takeover was occasioned principally by the hypocrisy of the Busia regime, coupled with the inefficient management by that regime of our economy."
With those words, Ghana's Second Republic was brought to an abrupt end. Colonel Acheampong, an unlikely coup maker in the eyes of many, had seized power without a single shot being fired. This coup swept away Prime Minister Abrefa Busia's elected government only 2.5 years after it had begun. What followed was a dramatic journey, the rise of a soldier statesman who promised to redeem Ghana from economic despair, and the eventual fall of his regime amid corruption, public discontent, and his own tragic demise by firing squad. Ignatius Kutu Acheampong was born on September 23, 1931, in the town of Trabuom in the Ashanti region of the Gold Coast, colonial Ghana. He was raised in a devout Roman Catholic family. A capable student, he obtained a middle school certificate and later a diploma in commerce after studying at the Central College of Commerce in Agona, Swedru. As a young man, Acheampong worked briefly as a stenographer in a timber firm and then as a teacher, rising to the position of vice principal of the Kumasi Commercial College, before finally turning to the military, where he found his true calling. In 1951, during the final years of British colonial rule, he enlisted as a private in the Gold Coast Regiment, part of the British West African Frontier Force. Later, he underwent officer training at Aldershot in England and earned his commission as a second lieutenant in the newly independent Ghanaian Army in 1959. Acheampong's early military career was marked by steady advancement. He participated in United Nations peacekeeping operations during the Congo crisis in the early 1960s, gaining valuable experience abroad. Back in Ghana, the ground was shaking politically. In 1966, a joint military-police coup overthrew President Kwame Nkrumah, and a new junta, the National Liberation Council, stepped in to run the country. Acheampong, by then a lieutenant colonel, was appointed Western Regional Commissioner under the NLC regime, giving him a first taste of governance as the administrative head of one of Ghana's regions. This role brought him into contact with senior coup makers such as Lieutenant General Akwasi Afrifa and other civilian politicians of the day. By 1969, when the NLC handed power to an elected civilian government, kickstarting the Second Republic, Acheampong had risen to command the 1st Infantry Brigade, one of the most strategic units of the army. Notably, he was among the few high-ranking officers of Akan origin in an army whose leadership had historically been ethnically mixed. This fact would later feed rumors about his political loyalties. In October 1969, Dr. Kofi Abrefa Busia became prime minister in the new civilian government. Busia was also an ethnic Akan and led the Progress Party. It was whispered in political circles that Colonel Acheampong, as a prominent Akan officer, had the confidence of Busia's government. Indeed, rumors had it that Acheampong, upon the recommendation of former head of state General Afrifa, became not only a close pal to Prime Minister Busia, but also to his ruling Progress Party. He was seen as an influential officer who would safeguard an Akan-led administration against any unrest. But behind this show of loyalty, Ghana's problems were piling up, and Acheampong's ambitions were quietly swelling with them. By 1971, Ghana's economy was in dire straits. Busia's government, though democratically elected, had become deeply unpopular due to a series of contentious policies and economic hardships. The global economic downturn at the time had hit Ghana's main exports, and Busia's attempts at austerity only fueled discontent. In what became a flashpoint, Busia's government imposed a drastic 44% devaluation of the Ghanaian cedi in December 1971. aiming to stabilize the balance of payments. The prices of imported goods immediately skyrocketed, and ordinary Ghanaians struggled as inflation hit them hard. The situation grew so desperate that by New Year's Eve of 1971, Busia himself warned that 1972 would be especially difficult due to the economic crisis. But economic woes were not the only issue. Busia's regime had alienated many through certain political decisions. He had enforced an infamous mass layoff of civil servants known as Apollo 568, which bred resentment in the bureaucracy. He also implemented an aliens compliance order in 1969 that expelled tens of thousands of Nigerian and other West African migrants from Ghana, causing social and economic disruptions. Furthermore, Busia's overture to establish dialogue with apartheid South Africa against the stance of the rest of Africa tarnished Ghana's image and angered Pan-Africanists. By late 1971, rumors of a military coup were rife in Accra. Busia, attempting to project confidence, publicly dismissed the prospect of a coup at a rally in mid-1971. Yet inside the barracks and marketplaces, frustration with the government was boiling over. The tipping point came with the late 1971 economic measures. The opposition lambasted Busia's devaluation as a policy of panic and despair. When Busia left Ghana for medical treatment in Britain in early January 1972, the moment of opportunity presented itself. Colonel Acheampong and a group of fellow officers decided to strike. On January 13, 1972, just 2 weeks into the new year, Acheampong and a band of officers struck fast, launching a swift pre-dawn coup that caught the country off guard. Busia's government was toppled almost without resistance. President Edward Akufo-Addo, the ceremonial president, was also removed. The speed and ease of the takeover indeed surprised many observers, not least because Acheampong had been perceived as a friend of the regime. But the colonel justified his actions as a patriotic duty. He cited economic mismanagement, rising inflation, and public dissatisfaction under Busia as the reasons for the military's intervention. Ghana, in his view, had to be saved from complete collapse. The new junta that took charge in Ghana styled itself as the National Redemption Council, the NRC.
Beloved Ghana, born with a deep sense of pride, nurtured with unshakable courage, has said goodbye forever to reaction, to timidity and hypocrisy in government, and to the suppression of the interests and welfare of the people. Together we shall make Ghana great. Long live the revolution. Long live Ghana. May God bless us all. Thank you.
A burst of energy and optimism marked Acheampong's early days in power. He projected himself as a man on a mission to rescue Ghana's economy and restore pride to the nation. In public speeches, he often invoked nationalism and self-reliance, echoing themes of Ghana's first president, Kwame Nkrumah. In fact, Acheampong was widely seen as having Nkrumahist sympathies. He assured Ghanaians that the change of government was nothing short of a revolution, aimed at transforming the country. Such rhetoric struck a chord with a populace yearning for strong leadership and solutions. True to his word, Acheampong wasted no time in implementing populist economic measures. In February 1972, less than a month after seizing power, he dramatically reversed Busia's currency devaluation, going against the prescription of the International Monetary Fund and making imports briefly cheaper in the country. From that point on, the new government imposed strict price controls on goods and launched crackdowns on hoarding, determined to combat inflation and profiteering. At the same time, Acheampong attempted to heal some of Ghana's old political wounds. Notably, just a few months after he took over, former President Kwame Nkrumah died in exile in April 1972. Acheampong's government allowed Nkrumah's body to be brought back to Ghana for a hero's burial in his hometown of Nkroful. This was a significant gesture, since Nkrumah had been living in exile after the 1966 coup, and many thought he would never rest on Ghanaian soil again. To many Ghanaians, this showed a spirit of reconciliation, in contrast to the previous military regime, which had vilified Nkrumah. Under Acheampong's watch, nationalism and self-reliance became the ethos of the day. Perhaps the most celebrated initiative of his regime was Operation Feed Yourself. Launched in 1972, this was a massive drive aimed at achieving food self-sufficiency in agriculture. Ghana, once a food exporter, had come to import large quantities of staple foods by the late 1960s, a trend Acheampong was determined to reverse. He and his Commissioner for Agriculture, Colonel Frank Bernasco, urged every Ghanaian to go back to the farm. Even urban dwellers were encouraged to tend garden plots. Under Operation Feed Yourself, state resources and propaganda were devoted to boosting domestic production of rice, maize, cassava, and vegetables. According to many accounts, the program achieved some success. Food production did increase, and Ghana became largely self-sufficient in maize and yams by the mid-1970s. The sight of Acheampong himself visiting rural farms, often in military fatigues but handing out farming tools, became a symbol of this campaign. Another headline policy was Operation Keep Right, implemented on August 4, 1974. In a single day, Ghana switched its traffic system from driving on the left, a legacy of British rule, to driving on the right-hand side of the road. This was part of Acheampong's broader effort to reorient Ghana after its colonial past and align with neighboring francophone countries that already drove on the right. The NRC regime also undertook numerous development projects. There was a national reconstruction program focusing on job creation and skills training. Urban infrastructure got attention. Streetlights in cities were repaired, and major sports stadiums were renovated to meet international standards. Large housing projects were started, the most famous being the Dansoman estate in Accra, which was then West Africa's largest planned housing development. Acheampong also initiated the Kapong Hydroelectric Project, a second dam on the Volta River designed to supplement the Akosombo Dam and boost electricity generation. By the mid-1970s, Ghana under Acheampong was experiencing, on the surface, a wave of national pride and relative stability. One commentator later reflected that,
"Never in the history of this country was a whole nation united under any government as was seen in the period from January 1972 to July 1978.
That might be an exaggeration born out of nostalgia. Still, it is true that in his initial years, General Acheampong enjoyed broad popularity. Indeed, by 1975, the regime felt secure enough to reshape itself. The junta transformed from the NRC into the Supreme Military Council, the SMC, essentially a military government with Acheampong at its helm as chairman. He surrounded himself with top military officers of diverse backgrounds. His second-in-command was General Fred Akufo and Akwapem, and other SMC members included Generals Robert Kote, Aga, Major General E.K. Utuka, and Ewe, Yao Boache, and Ashanti, and others. This ethnic mix in the junta was deliberate. By balancing the tribal composition of his government, he projected national unity and maintained the loyalty of the military rank and file. For a while, Acheampong's rule brought real improvements to Ghana. But even in those good days, small cracks were beginning to form. The 1973 oil crisis, combined with a sharp decline in cocoa prices, Ghana's main export, had a severe impact on the economy. Furthermore, the initial boost from revaluing the currency proved unsustainable. In fact, maintaining an artificially high Ghanaian cedi led to new distortions. Imported goods grew scarce because importers couldn't get enough foreign exchange at the official rate. By the mid-1970s, basic commodities such as rice, sugar, milk, and soap began to disappear from store shelves. Queues for basic goods became a common sight in towns and cities. The government responded by doubling down on price controls and anti-hoarding measures, but these interventions backfired. A vast black market economy, known colloquially as kalabule, took root. In markets like Makola in Accra and Asafo in Kumasi, hoarders would stash goods and only sell at several times the controlled price to those desperate enough to pay. As a result, an entire class of army officers, bureaucrats, and businessmen reportedly enriched themselves through smuggling and kickbacks. Before long, corruption had begun to penetrate the highest levels of the government. Ironically, a regime that came to cleanse hypocrisy was now mired in its own hypocrisy. Many top officials and military men were living well beyond their salaries, acquiring plush mansions and fleets of cars. Driven by this economic desperation, Acheampong adopted a bold and controversial foreign policy, known as the yentua policy. The word yentua, meaning "we won't pay" in Akan, was a blunt message to Ghana's foreign creditors. Ghana was done repaying its debts. You see, by the mid-1970s, Ghana was drowning in foreign debt, and Acheampong insisted the country needed breathing space. So, he simply refused to pay interest on certain loans and defaulted on others, especially those he deemed odious or had been accumulated by previous regimes. To many neighboring African countries, this bold move felt like a proud rebellion. Ghana was finally standing up to powerful neo-colonial lenders such as the IMF and the World Bank. However, the backlash was severe. International creditors and donors turned their backs on Ghana, cutting off vital aid and credit. Suddenly, the country was unable to import enough basic goods because suppliers abroad refused to sell on credit. Fuel shortages deepened. At one point, even fishing trawlers were stuck at port for lack of fuel and spare parts, and fish, a staple of the Ghanaian diet, became scarce. By 1977, life for the average Ghanaian had become exceedingly difficult. University students, who had initially been enamored of Acheampong's nationalist rhetoric, grew restive as campuses ran out of supplies and graduate job prospects faded. Sensing the mood turning against him, Acheampong resorted to the classic playbook of African strongmen: censorship and repression. Critical newspapers were silenced, and outspoken voices, journalists, lawyers, and old opposition figures from the Busia era were arrested or kept under close surveillance. Yet, for all his flaws, Acheampong's rule was not drenched in blood. Compared to some of the brutal juntas elsewhere in West Africa at the time, his regime was, in relative terms, less violent and less openly savage. For instance, there were multiple attempted coups against him, including one led by a businessman by the name of Alex Hama in 1973. While those plotters were initially condemned to death, Acheampong later pardoned them after short prison terms. No executions of coup plotters or political prisoners took place under his tenure, a fact supporters cite to this day. This comparative leniency would stand in stark contrast to what followed his regime. However, the absence of brutal repression did not save Acheampong's regime from public anger. By 1977, open dissent was on the rise. Professional groups, like the Bar Association, student unions, and even some within the military, were grumbling that the revolution had been derailed by corruption and mismanagement. Under mounting pressure for a return to civilian rule, Acheampong in late 1976 floated the idea of a union government, or Unigov for short, a power-sharing arrangement between the military and civilians with no political parties. He argued that Ghana's partisan politics had been divisive and that a new system was needed where competent civilians could join soldiers in governing without the rivalry of party politics. Unfortunately, many Ghanaians saw this as a thinly veiled plan for Acheampong and the military to retain power indefinitely under a civilian facade. Undeterred, Acheampong set in motion a process to legitimize his idea. A national referendum on the union government was scheduled for March 30th, 1978, so that Ghanaians could vote yes or no to the concept of a military-civilian hybrid regime. The lead-up to this referendum further polarized the country. University students and lecturers spearheaded the No campaign, insisting that the military had no business staying in politics. They demanded a full return to multi-party democracy. On the other side, the government mobilized resources for a Yes campaign, saturating state media with pro-Unigov messages. The atmosphere grew tense. At one point, protests and clashes erupted between pro- and anti-Unigov demonstrators, and at least 4 people were killed in the city of Kumasi. When the day of the referendum came, the official results, announced by the Electoral Commissioner, Mr. Justice Isaac Aban, claimed a narrow victory for Acheampong's yes side, around 60% in favor and 40% against. But this outcome was immediately met with accusations of fraud. Many educated Ghanaians simply did not believe that the majority had truly voted for continued military rule. The situation turned almost ludicrous as the Chief Electoral Commissioner himself, Justice Aban, went into hiding, apparently fearing that the military rulers might force him to tamper further with the results. His disappearance only fueled suspicions that the vote count had been manipulated under duress. In the end, this exercise, instead of legitimizing Acheampong, became the final trigger for his downfall. As one Ghanaian observer later put it succinctly,
Acheampong's drive to make himself president for life through the Union government was his undoing. Once the people say no, and you want to turn it to yes, you are bound to fall.
Following this, many senior officers, including some members of the Supreme Military Council, felt Acheampong had led them into a political disaster. Behind the scenes, a plan was hatched by Acheampong's second-in-command, Lieutenant General Fred Akufo, and a small circle of officers to remove the head of state from power. In the early hours of July 5, 1978, while most of Ghana slept, they moved. No troops marched in the streets, and no gunshots were heard. It was an internal coup within the ruling council. Senior officers confronted General Acheampong and essentially forced him to resign as head of state. Acheampong, perhaps sensing that he had lost all support, offered no resistance. The next morning, radio announcements informed Ghanaians that General Fred W.K. Akufo had replaced Acheampong as the new chairman of the Supreme Military Council, and Acheampong was placed under house arrest. Ghanaians greeted the news with mixed feelings. While Acheampong had been popular in his early years, the hardships of the late 1970s had turned much of the populace against him. Still, many did not rejoice excessively. You see, Acheampong was an Ashanti, and there was a palpable sadness in parts of the Ashanti region at the fall of their son. General Akufo's new military government tried to distance itself from Acheampong's mistakes. It lifted some of the more burdensome economic restrictions and promised to return Ghana to civilian rule by mid-1979. For a brief moment, it seemed Acheampong's story might end with him simply living quietly in exile within Ghana. But fate had a darker conclusion in store. Less than a year after Acheampong's overthrow, events in Ghana took another dramatic turn, this time led by a fiery young Air Force officer by the name of Flight Lieutenant Jerry John Rawlings. On June 4, 1979, junior officers and enlisted men, inspired by Rawlings, launched a mutiny that spiraled into a full-blown coup. They overthrew General Akufo's government, which had itself been in power for only 11 months. Suddenly, Ghana was in the hands of the Armed Forces Revolutionary Council, the AFRC, with Flight Lieutenant Rawlings as its public leader. These revolutionaries had a very stark agenda. In their eyes, former leaders like Acheampong were chiefly responsible for Ghana's woes due to years of corruption and abuse of office. As a result, Rawlings and his cohorts swiftly arrested many senior military figures of the previous regimes. Acheampong, now 47 years old, was seized at his village house. Though stripped of power, he could not escape the tide of retribution sweeping through the country. He was transported back to Accra to face justice at the hands of the very institution he once commanded. What followed was a summary court-martial of Acheampong and several of his fellow deposed generals. The AFRC set up special military tribunals to try the ex-rulers for corruption, misuse of power, and violation of the public trust. Acheampong was accused of using his position to amass wealth while in office and recklessly dissipating state funds to the detriment of the country. The tribunal found him guilty of corruption and sentenced him to death. Before dawn on June 16, 1979, Ignatius Acheampong was taken from his cell along with another condemned officer, Major General E.K. Utuka, the former border guard commander. Under tight guard, they were driven to a military firing range at Teshi, near the coast, about 4 miles from central Accra. This was the same field where Ghana had carried out executions of coup plotters in the past. The last such execution had been in 1967 after an earlier coup attempt. Facing his final moments, General Acheampong displayed a demeanor that observers found striking. As he was led out to the execution ground, Acheampong smiled and waved a white handkerchief toward the small cluster of reporters present. It was a surreal gesture, whether of courage, defiance, or a kind of resignation, none can say for sure. He was then bound to the stake. Along with Utuka, he had a red hood placed over his head as the firing squad, composed of young soldiers, aimed. In the first light of that morning, volleys of gunfire rang out, and the former head of state fell. Acheampong's death sent shockwaves across Ghana. He was not the only one to face the firing squad. In the June to July 1979 purge, 8 senior military officers were executed. Among them, 2 other former heads of state, General Fred Akufo and Lieutenant General Akwasi Afrifa. These events remain among the most dramatic and controversial in Ghana's history. Flight Lieutenant Jerry John Rawlings and the AFRC ruled for only a few months in 1979, just long enough to purge the military hierarchy and oversee new elections. True to their word, the AFRC handed over power to an elected civilian president by the name of Hilla Liman in September 1979. But Ghana's respite from military rule was short-lived. Rawlings, dissatisfied with the civilian government's performance, would strike again on December 31, 1981, overthrowing President Liman and installing himself as leader. That second coming of Rawlings began a nearly 2-decade era of revolutionary government and later guided the transition to democracy.